Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. We've got a special guest today, Joe Firestone. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. I had some other things planned to say, but I couldn't pronounce them right, so who cares? Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back. Are we just consumers? Is it only acceptable to make changes to the system we live in as individuals, making different market choices? Or collectively through businesses and corporations responding to market fluctuations? Of course not. We are also citizens and we have governments that represent us, but what are the limitations of that government? I'm your host, Dave Folks, and in Real Time with Steve Keen and friends this week, our friend is Joseph M. Firestone. We'll be exploring what real fiscal responsibility should look like and how it goes together with democracy and citizenship. So where does citizenship fit in the market-centric worldview? Is it the same as the idea of voting with your money? Let's take it back to some basics and have a think about this. I mean, there is a process that's often called democratization, but by entrepreneurs when they talk about disruptive new products or services. But of course, that's total bollocks because there's not the same, ratios of votes to dollars. But in a functioning democracy, consumers and citizens make different choices. As a consumer in the market, you may want to smoke cigarettes. It's a free country until we discover that passive smoking is harmful to those that don't smoke. Now, as a non-smoking consumer, you can't do anything about that except to not buy and smoke cigarettes yourself. But as a citizen, you can support legislation that bans smoking indoors at least. So why am I hammering on about this metaphor? Of course, it's possible that you can have government overreach. Should smoking be completely banned, for example, or should people be allowed to smoke if they want to within certain constraints? What we don't hear so much about is private overreach. Because with public spending and on much bigger issues, without the ability to spend a public monopoly on money as per a democratic mandate, we are left in the position of the non-smoking consumer. That brings me back to our guest. It's Joe's contention that the public debt is a destructive narrative and that a real fiscal responsibility, Freudian slip, real fiscal responsibility is something completely different to what you hear in the news cycle. Among other things, he's been a staunch advocate for ending government bond issuing, which is in effect the private ownership of government spending, the minting of the trillion-dollar coin concept, and the winding down of existing bond commitments to end the toxic debt ceiling myth. Joe is critical of conventional economic practices that emphasize debt and deficit reduction at the expense of public welfare. He argues for overt congressional financing, OCF, a system where the Federal Reserve directly funds federal spending to eliminate the need for debt issuance, thereby ending the political manipulation surrounding the national debt and deficit. So we'll be talking deficits, the national debt, austerity, and, among other things, minting the $1 trillion coin. Oh yes, that's where we're going today, people. So strap in and enjoy the ride. If anything, it'll be a welcome break for our UK listeners who are being served a daily diet of the My Fiscal Responsibility is Bigger Than Yours willy waving contest, which currently passes for debates in the upcoming election campaign. But before we talk to Joe, let me bring on the stars of the show, starting with the man voted most likely to be the guy organising civilization by ham radio in the event of a nuclear war, Mike Radzinski.
Hi, Dave.
Hello, mate. How was that intro? That work for you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When everything else fails, ham radio will be there. Next week is field day, and so that's the biggest weekend in all of ham radio. So we'll be in the field practicing our emergency communications.
Superb. Good. Well, to be honest with you, if you're the John Connor that I end up talking to after a nuclear war, that'll make me feel a little bit better somehow, I think. So that's good. And
yeah, just a quick comment. When you were talking about smoking, I always tell my students when I was an undergraduate, you'd go into the classroom and every other desk would have a foil ashtray and every other student was smoking. Then the professor would come in and be smoking. And I would be like trying to see the board but nobody thought anything of it, back then.
I know it was totally normal.
Yeah.
Even when, I was in my 20s when it was banned in the UK, at least indoors. And it was overnight change from going out to the pub, right, and having a late night, and the next morning everything you wore, including yourself, stank of smoke, of course, to overnight just gone. It's an incredible change. So, yeah, just it goes to show. So I hope that was a useful metaphor, at least, picking on smokers there, probably. But shall we bring on Steve? Don't mess with me, Keen. Here he is.
That's getting closer to the root. Yeah. I'm getting in that mood.
You're getting in that mood. Yeah, what's going on, Steve? It didn't sound like you were too happy back there backstage.
Well, people know I'm working on a software package called Ravel. And software, there's one thing that if you have software, you also have bugs. No choice about the matter. And I thought we were ready to launch it maybe next week. And then I found a series of bugs and I went, oh, geez, it's back to the coding desk once more. So, release crush. It's taken this. I was smiling until 2 hours ago when I discovered this set of bugs. And Russell's going to wake up in the morning and go, holy shit, because, of course, he's in Australia. He's asleep right now. He's going to wake up and find about a dozen bug reports by me, which is going to really make his weekend.
So a big area, Steve, of system dynamics modeling is project management. And Tarak Abdel Hamid has a book on software project management. System dynamics model of it, and you might want to take a look at it. And it's like 90% of the bugs show up when 90% of the project is allegedly finished, and suddenly all the bugs arise. So your situation is normal in software project management.
Thanks for cheering me up, mate. Yeah.
It's what it is.
I think it's time we brought on our guest for today. Let's bring on Joe. Joe Firestone, it is a pleasure to have you on Real Time with Steve Keen and Friends.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with Steve Keen and Friends.
Very good. You've been writing books, at least that I can see, since 2002, publishing so many books on the subjects that we're going to cover today. So I kind of wanted just a little bit of background for those who are unfamiliar with you about your areas of interest from the horse's mouth rather than from me. About what got you interested in these areas and what you hope people are going to take away from today, maybe just anything that comes to mind.
Okay. How much background do you want? 2 minutes?
I think
10 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds.
I tell you what's always nice is just something that you felt really an event or maybe a set of events that really got you into this area of thinking and this way of thinking would be good if there's an experience you had. Do you think?
Okay, I can certainly do that.
Sure.
So, I'm going to go back to when I first got into to MMT. it was the end of 2009. Until that time, I'd been blogging on politics. My background had been in multivariate analysis, statistical analysis, political science, international relations, and in knowledge management also for roughly 15 years before I got into MMT. So I have also a little bit of background in project management, of course, and a little bit of background in software as well. I even know a little bit about system dynamics too. Okay,
You're amongst friends.
Then I decided to find my political voice again in 2008 and 2009. And in the process of finding my political voice, I ran into this lady called Celise. Of course, that wasn't her real name. That was her handle on Fire Dog Lake. And she was an excellent commenter there, very analytical. And one day, she told me about Warren Mosler and MMT and the 7 deadly innocent frauds. Of course, I was very busy, so it took me 2 months to get to it. And I got to it at the end of 2009, December of 2009. And it was just like lightning struck me. I had some preparation because I had read some other books during the 90s, which were very skeptical about the need for debt and were very skeptical about constraints on federal spending. So I was a little prepared, but still, Warren's little book really got to me. And then I dove into MMT deeply for roughly 3 months or so. And I found myself in April of 2010, at the beginning of April, I heard about this Fiscal summit that was going on in DC, and that was being put together by the Peterson Foundation, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. If anybody knows anything about them, they're the austerity mongers of the world. Okay. And so they were putting together this fiscal summit, working in tandem with the Obama administration, which had started a fiscal commission about a month earlier. And so this fiscal summit was supposed to be in support of the fiscal commission. And immediately I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a fiscal sustainability teach-in counter-conference in order to oppose the fiscal summit? So I got this idea on April 9th, and in 19 days, we put together the teach-in counter-conference, which occurred on the same day as the fiscal summit. And that was a one-day conference, and it was a small conference. There were only 50 people there. But there were so many good people there, and the question and answer periods were so outstanding. And the program on the conference involved Bill Mitchell. He led off at first, and he was followed by Stephanie Kelton. Warren Mosler was the keynote speaker at lunch. And then there was Marshall Auerbach doing something on inflation, just after lunch, inflation, Weimar, Zimbabwe, all that kind of stuff.
The old favorites.
And then finally, Randy Ray and Pavlina Chernyeva ended things off with a session on policy. And at the end of each of the sessions, there was a Q&A, of about a half hour. And the Q&As were pretty deep. They surfaced most of the major problems or supposed problems that you hear about so far as MMT is concerned, just in that conference. there were very few other things I heard about that later provided any problems for the MMTers. So the conference was very rich. There were slides that came out of it. There were videos that came out of it. There were podcasts that came out of it. And there were many people who began to blog once they had come to the conference. So the conference created a lot of activity for MMT. And it got me really enthused about it. And I just began to blog like crazy, like 3 blogs a day on MMT for quite some time. And so that's what got me started. Since then, I've been blogging until about 2017 or 2018. Then I decided, well, there weren't as many people looking at my blogs anymore. So I decided I wanted to get into streaming. So I ran into Steve Grumbine, at a conference. And Steve wanted somebody, who knew MMT to get into his Real Progressives group. I agreed to come aboard and start to stream. So I streamed over there for a couple of years. And then following that, Steve and a number of others of us got into some disagreements. So 4 of us all left at the same time and started our own thing. 3 of the 4 of us dropped out soon due to requests from family and economic considerations and things like that.
Joe,
and so I ended up
reasonable to ask what the disagreements were about? Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to know if it's useful to the discussion to know if there were disagreements over the things that we're going to talk about in terms of, fiscal responsibility and public purpose, that kind of thing.
No, there were no disagreements about that. What the disagreements were about was the organization of the Real Progressives group.
Oh, fair enough. It's probably not relevant to the discussion unless you think it is, but I just wanted to just check on that.
It isn't relevant. It isn't relevant to
this discussion. Fair enough.
It was purely over management considerations.
I understand. So can we look at what you've termed fiscal sustainability, or at least that issue? That's the first one that we wanted to cover, and find a way into that subject area. And I guess for those, I'm trying to gauge how much of our audience is completely familiar with this, of course, and how much isn't. And Stephen, Mike, you also know, so you might step in. But it was kind of like, to what level are we being misguided by this term fiscal sustainability, and to what level are we open to the argument that we don't need to worry so much about the money being spent, it's more where it gets spent? Is that the right way of framing it?
I think that's a good way to frame it. But if you will, I'd like to start off with some concepts because those are relevant when we get to real fiscal responsibility.
Sure, go ahead.
First one I want to start off with is public purpose. Now, I guess the term public purpose was introduced at first by John Kenneth Galbraith in his Economics and the Public Purpose in 1972. I should have said somewhere that I'm a political scientist, by education. That's where my PhD is. It's in international politics, and in comparative politics. But I got a hold of economics, and the public purpose, and I was very interested in what Galbraith had to say from a politics point of view. But he never really said what he meant by the public purpose in that book. He just, sort of talked all around it. But it was a beautifully written book, and it really got me involved in thinking about this notion. I encountered it again when I read the 7 deadly innocent frauds by Warren Mosler, because he kept referring to public purpose, that this particular thing wasn't in accord with the public purpose and that wasn't in accord with the public purpose. Kept on talking about the public purpose. And he never said what that actually meant, but it was, he seemed to use it as some sort of criterion. So I began to think about that, and over a period of time, I decided that public purpose is an abstraction. It's a multidimensional composite. It has components such as full employment and price stability, perhaps a Medicare for All program, first class educational system, representing the gap a nation perceives and is motivated to end between the state of the nation today and the state of the nation that it as a collective thinks ought to exist. So if you look at that formulation, that is a formulation that suggests that public purpose is a normative concept. Okay, of course, it has a descriptive component also, because when you look at a nation or any group, you can describe their concept, okay, of public purpose. But when you start thinking about what public purpose should be yourself, when you start thinking about a normative theory of public purpose, then you're into normative, okay, and value theory. So I just wanted to state that to start off with. Now, going on to fiscal sustainability. Fiscal sustainability is the capability of a government to keep on spending without reducing its capability to spend. If you say that some policies of government are fiscally unsustainable, what you're saying is that those policies are undermining the future capability to spend. So, okay, I'd like people...
Which is the subtext of pretty much all the discourse economically in the public sphere, right? I mean, we don't hear this other alternative view very often.
That's true. That's true, we don't. Okay, now I want to get to fiat sovereigns and fiscal sustainability. For a fiat sovereign government, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like Australia, like Japan, like New Zealand, whose capability to issue currency, by currency I mean bank reserves, paper currency, and coins, where that capability is constitutionally unlimited. That's one characteristic of a fiat sovereign. The second characteristic is that the fiat sovereign has made its currency non-convertible to any other commodity or currency. A third characteristic of fiat sovereignty is that if you're a fiat sovereign, you shall have no debts in foreign currencies, no debts in currencies that are not your own, that you're not able to issue, okay, at will. And fourth, if you're going to be a fiat sovereign, you have to allow the price of your own currency to freely float, okay, in international trading. Now, from these assumptions, it follows that there's literally no fiscal sustainability issue, because the capability of a fiat sovereign to keep on spending can never be diminished. Of course, that's a bit of an overstatement. It could be diminished if the government were to lose entirely the legitimacy of the government. Then the currency can be undermined, but if we assume the political situation, is reasonably stable, then there's literally no fiscal sustainability issue because governments can keep on spending because they can pay off any debts they might incur or buy anything they need because they have an unlimited capability to issue currency.
Do you mind, Joe, if I step in for a sec and I want to bring in Steve on that. And Steve, I'm going to ask a kind of childlike question, which I reckon some people in the audience might be thinking. It's kind of like, so to what point could you spend up to a gazillion dollars or pounds or whatever in the deficit column of a government before or if it ever becomes a problem? I want to take that to the extreme. And, is it a paper tiger, that number? And it depends what it's spent on.
Well, the
Okay,
government's got. Sorry, you want me to answer that? Is that for me,
Yes,
Dave?
please go. Yeah, go, Steve. That's what I was asking.
Okay. You've got. I basically take my position, as people are probably aware, comes more from circuit theory, the post-Keynesian approach of circuit theory, than MMT. So I came to MMT late. But what I get out of both of them is that you have two ways to create money in a modern economy. One is the credit system, which creates money by lending out more than it gets back in repayments. And as MMT emphasizes, that doesn't increase the net financial assets of the private sector. They get, for every dollar they get in an asset, they get a dollar in debt. Whereas the MMT, the state creates money, and this is again from my Minsky modeling perspective, not from the way that MMT talks about it. From what I've done from Minsky, the government creates fiat money by going into negative equity. So it takes on financial liabilities without matching financial assets. Therefore, its equity goes negative. But that causes a precisely opposite and equal increase in the equity of the private sector because the financial claims the government's creating on itself become financial assets for the private sector. So those are the two methods. Now, you then have to relate it to the physical economy, the productive system, and what are you doing to the level of demand in the productive system, and where is that demand going? Now, one area people know that I disagree with MMT on is the attitude to foreign trade, and I'm going to be doing much more detailed work on that in the near future, because I think they neglect the extent to which it actually follows from their own logic, and also from straight accounting, that a government surplus has exactly the same negative effect on the money supply as a trade deficit does. Okay, if you have a trade deficit,
yes,
money's going, it's dollar for dollar equivalent. So the question is, what's the impact of that on the economy? Now, my attitude, and this is where I differ from MMT, that if you have government money creation, and for that matter, private credit money creation, they can both do it, leading to a blowout in your trade balance. So you actually import more than you export, and also that you then end up selling domestic assets to cover as part of the process of your currency being sent overseas. That can damage your sustainability. So I see the first limit I would see, you don't want to have a government deficit which causes a trade deficit that undermines your monetary sovereignty over time. And you want to basically, as much of the benefits of government money creation, you want to stay inside the country that created it. So I see those are the sort of overall constraints. In terms of what the government can do, it's got limitless capacity to do it. It's just how much financial negative equity it decides to go into. That's why we saw during COVID, the deficits hit 20% of GDP in most of the Western world. And that was absolutely no problem with them doing that. The impact of it is another story. But if that hadn't been done, we would have had a financial collapse. So it was absolutely vital that the government create money at that time. Now, then, the aftermath of that, what did that do to the economy? We've seen a boost in aggregate demand sufficient to enable corporations to put up their markups, because Isabella Weber identified, and you get the same coming out of the work of Blair Fix as well. The increase in the level of aggregate demand inside those economies led mainly to corporations increasing markups even faster than they've done in the past, and that's what gave us that bout of inflation. So you do have negative consequences coming out of this potentially, and you do have to tune your level of money creation to the rate of real economic growth that you're trying to sustain, whatever that might be. So I don't see it as being limitless. I see the capacity as being limitless, but the effects have to be attenuated.
Okay, I agree with that. Okay, and I agree with your point of view that there can be very negative consequences of trade deficits that are extremely large. It depends on the areas. Okay, they're extremely large, and of course, but that falls under the general heading of the consequences. Okay, of deficit spending. Uh, I don't think that MMTers say, at least I don't say, and I don't think Stephanie Kelton says, and I don't think Warren Mosler says, or maybe he does, I'm not sure. But I don't think he says that one can keep on spending without concern for the consequences. Okay, in fact,
Nobody says an MMT. That's one of the ways it's caricatured by critics.
right. Okay, so I think what MMTers really think is that uh, the fiscal capacity, in the sense of the capacity to issue the currency and to have very large deficits, is always there. But that doesn't mean that you want to have very large deficits, okay, or deficits that are spent in a particular way. When and what and how you spend is very, very important because it deals with the consequences. And so that gets me into something which I think gets closer to you, Steve,
Yeah.
okay, and that is it gets me to consider the area, okay, of impact analysis. Okay, I
Okay.
think a very important part, okay, of MMT is whether you do deficit spending or whether you don't do deficit spending, the issue is always what is the impact of your fiscal policy. And there are different areas or different aspects, okay, of impact. Okay, there's the issue of simply the descriptive impact, but there's also the issue of the impact on public purpose. And I think the issue of the impact on public purpose is a very important one for MMT, okay, and also suggests that the kind of modeling that you do, Steve, is very important, okay, for MMT because it would be the kind of modeling you would have to do to assess impact in a fine way. And I think that's what we need to do, not only for economics, but for policy, okay, as well. And so I'm very much in favor of the kind of work that you do. I did at various times in my life considerable research into system dynamics, and I have a very favorable view, okay, of the methodology.
Mm.
And I don't see any conflict between that, okay, and MMT.
No,
And
there
I,
is no necessary conflict. There's some what you might call managerial conflict coming out, I've got to say, which I'm extremely pissed off with, because I want to get MMT to adopt MNC because it's as you say, it's the perfect way to model what MMT argues about. It's the only software package on the planet that enables you to do comprehensive double entry bookkeeping modeling, and very rapidly at that, of an integrated financial system. So yeah, I want MMT to adopt it, and I'm frankly annoyed that they're resisting it.
okay, well, this is one MMTer who is not resisting.
Good.
Okay, so I can say that, straight away.
Yeah.
I've always liked doing impact analysis through a system dynamics approach.
Mm.
Perhaps not only system dynamics, there are software packages that incorporate both system dynamics and other kinds of modeling, okay, as well, and that break the impact analysis down into blocks,
Mm.
where some of the blocks uh, are using system dynamics modeling and other blocks are, using other types of modeling. And then there are methodological considerations about what you would use for particular purposes. Okay, but from my point of view, since one of my central concerns is public purpose, And because I think the assessment of fiscal policy on public purpose is so important, I think one of the frontiers for MMT work is, first of all, to more closely specify what we mean by public purpose, specify the dimensions of public purpose, figure out how to measure public purpose. And I'm aware of some techniques that can help with that, and have used them, in the past. And I know that those kinds of measures hook up very well to a system dynamics approach. And I've taught classes in the knowledge management area where I've taught rudimentary system dynamics, and also taught the measure modeling approaches that can accompany it. So anyway, just to summarize, I have a very favorable view of what you're doing, and I think it can articulate very well, if not with MMT as it currently stands, with what I think the future of MMT is going to be.
Mike, can
Good
I
point.
bring
Yeah.
you in for a sec here? Just and I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there a kind of practical example you can think of where system dynamics modeling has had an impact or can have an impact on policy? So you can go, right, well, here's an example. I don't know if there is one, or what makes you think of anyway? We haven't heard from you.
Off the top of my head, things that would have been known to people. When you get credit card applications in the mail, sometimes it's overwhelming. Thanks System Dynamics. OnStar and General Motors auto leasing program is based on System Dynamics. Let's see what else. A lot of work has been done in developing nations with the T21 by the Millennium Institute, where they tune up an SD model for various developing nations and do policy. Let's see. I refereed some years ago a big system dynamics model for the House Banking Committee that was done to look at some banking policy. So, the largest user in the United States government of system dynamics is the Department of Energy. They have a giant system dynamics model they look at energy policy issues with. So, and I could go on. A couple of comments. Why don't MMTers use system dynamics? My suspicion is it's the discrete versus continuous modeling algorithm behind the scenes, or the conceptualization. MMTers do use stock flow consistent modeling, Mark Lavoie and Wynne Godley stuff, but they use difference equations. And now we can repeat. I take, I've shown Mark Lavoie, here's your chapter 3 in your book. Here's your model redone in system dynamics. In discrete time, I exactly reproduce his stuff. And then I say, if we were to do it our way, here's, So I think economists are just used to discrete time modeling. And that's because economic data are released according to an economic calendar in discrete chunks. And there's just this, it's path dependent. That's how it's always been done. So that's how we're going to do it. We're locked in to this discrete time perspective. On the matter of public purpose, I think I've mentioned on these live streams in the past that, at least in the system dynamics world that I live in, it is normal to build a system dynamics model using all the good practices and what have you, and then turn it into a game. It's not a haha, let's kill zombies game, but it's an engaging, it could even be fun, serious game, so people can discover insights on their own by interacting with the model. And among the important things we do when we develop a game is we create a scoring metric. So what you got to be able to compare simulation experiments, policy runs, which run is best and why, and you have to explain what good means, or better, or improved. And it's almost always multivariate. It's rarely the case that the red curve is bad, it's going up. Ooh, now the red curve, which is bad, is going down. Hooray. Usually what defines good or better or what have you. There's a list of, a dozen things that go into what we want to see for our socioeconomic systems, and there's trade-offs. More of this often means less of that. So on net, what do you want? And then you get into how do you weight these things and whatever, and you get into arrows and possibility theorem and what have you. But at least if we try to define a scoring metric in the game, you could say, if you don't like our weightings, weight it any way you want. Now run your simulation experiment.
So in short, Joe, we don't have there's not a sustainability issue in any real sense. It seems that it's well established by MMT, and I think most people are familiar with that. What would you say on the politics of why it seems, at least in the developed countries, with sovereign currencies, Europe and the States and Japan and maybe and of course UK, that politicians are addicted, it seems, to this narrative that we can possibly run out of money. Why is that that stick around? And is it just a narrative change, or is there more to it than that? As in, it's useful as a myth, is kind of what I'm getting at.
I think it's useful, as a myth, because they want to constantly use the idea of taxpayer money. In other words, they want to be able to say, you're using all this taxpayer money in Gaza to support a genocide. It's very attractive to political types to use that kind of formulation. And even when they know better, even when they have some knowledge, of MMT, they're drawn again and again to the idea of they're using our taxpayer money to do this terrible thing, this or that terrible thing. There are always 50 terrible things that are running around where people are using taxpayer money. So I think it's a function of language and a function, of narrative. The idea of taxpayer money is too attractive for practical politicians, to give up. And I also find myself, when I'm sometimes talking politics, and I do a lot of that, and I do a lot of criticism of international policies of the United States, domestic policies of the United States, I find myself absolutely struggling never to say taxpayer money.
It's that ingrained, right? It's in our culture.
Just what I'm successful. I never say taxpayer money. But it's a struggle. Your mind just goes naturally to that. So there's a function for that kind of argument, and people don't want to give up the function. And I think that is very important. You have to really believe in a position such as MMT in order to discipline yourself to get away from the idea. And you have to accept that in actual fact, when you look at the accounting, the strict accounting, that tax revenues don't fund anything because they're destroyed in the process of settlement. But you have to know that. And so then you have to discipline yourself after that into never saying taxpayer money or talking about taxpayer money. So I would answer it, in that way. But then also, there's bad faith. I mean, there are people who know better and who understand better, but it's just too valuable a meme for them to give up. And so they just want to use it, to their advantage.
Yeah. And before we go, so go ahead.
Yeah, just to amplify what Joe's saying, I think it goes back to Keynes and the fallacy of composition and the paradox of thrift. Why do we have macroeconomics as one of the two big disciplines of economics? What isn't the macroeconomy just microeconomics summed up? The answer is no. Keynes showed us that, if you save more, that's good. If I save more, it's good. If we all save more, you cause a recession. That the behavior of the whole is not the same as the behavior of individual parts. That's why we have macroeconomics. And people cannot make the conceptual leap from, well, I have to balance the budget at my house. Why can't the federal government balance theirs? And I think Joe is right. Even those politicians who know better can exploit what I just said to their advantage.
It's also the way that it's framed by There's also the way it's framed by economic textbooks, and this is where the idea comes from. It's a disease transmitted by textbooks. Okay,
Yeah.
I think forget about wearing masks. Just wear goggles whenever you see a neoclassical textbook, because what they do is they put it in supply and demand framework, the whole loanable funds thing. And we were talking about this last week, of course, with George Seglin or Selgin. Okay, and that is okay. You got demand and supply, and the government has more demand. Bang, up goes the price, gets more expensive, crowds out the private sector. That's just the framing. There's everything for every problem. There's a supply and demand equation, and it's wrong. If I can paraphrase mention on that front. So that's the intellectual framework there. They said, oh, forget it. Forget about this accounting stuff. I understand accounting. I know what accounting is. Let's just put a supply and demand diagram here and show what happens. And that's what they do. And because, and this is actually one of my good mates back in Australia, was working in the Keating government, which is a Labor Party, supposedly progressive government. It gave us a large part of what we now have around the world. I think in many ways I blame Keating for neoliberalism and certainly some of his side effects. But he said what had happened inside the cabinet office is that some catastrophe, some crisis would come and some external event would affect them. And what do you go and do? And they'd fit around and mull and talk and nobody getting anywhere. And suddenly somebody would say something that came out of a first year economic textbook. Because they've all done it, oh yeah, that makes sense, let's do that. So we end up with that framing is a poison. I want to get rid of that meme of supply and demand diagram. I want to do this to supply and demand diagram. Put one over the top and get rid of the damn thing. But that framing
cancel culture
is
on
why
that.
they fall. Yeah, that's why they fall for it. So you put it in a supply demand diagram. It's obvious. Government wants to spend more. It's therefore got to borrow more. There's less loanable funds for the rest of us. Therefore, the government will reduce the rate of economic growth and make the private sector perform more badly. When you do the accounting, you get exactly the opposite. The government creates money when it spends more than it gets back in taxation. It increases the supply of loanable funds by running a deficit. It doesn't reduce it. And that's the power of the MMT framing, which, of course, Minsky is absolutely brilliant at highlighting. You cannot get loanable funds out of Minsky.
And Joe, before we move on I want to elaborate on what you mean by public purpose. You've touched on it. I want to come back to it. Would it be a distraction if at the public level we had it would sound like semantics, maybe just a linguistic war, but is it important to attack the word debt, for example? And so at a public level, at a government level, it really isn't the word to use. I mean, or is that just linguistic nonsense? I mean, I get confused by it because I see it used all the time. And I go, is it really a debt? Well, I know empirically now it's not. So what do you think of that? Or was that a distraction, do you think, to go after a war on words like that?
Okay, I'm not sure that it's a distraction. It's from a macro point of view.
But for the public who are talking about these things like the taxpayer myth and debt, they hear the word debt, and these are it's the public that also
debt.
need to convince.
Let me explain. Okay.
Yeah.
From a macro point of view, we can easily see there's no debt because the government spends first. Okay, but from the point of view of the individual, from the micro point of view, there's no doubt the individual is buying a debt instrument and the government is committed to pay back, okay, the debt instrument. Okay, and by the way, the 14th Amendment guarantees the government is going to pay all debts, right? Okay, so there's no question that there are debts from the point of view of the individual transaction. And there's no question that the government is going to have to pay back those debts. On the other hand, from the macro point of view, there's no problem with the fact that there are debts, even though they're large debts, okay, because the government could use certain instrumentalities to ensure that those debts are always paid back on time and with the interest that was promised. Okay, and later on, I'll get into some things, okay, the government can do to pay back all debts and to demonstrate that the level of debt and the level of the debt to GDP ratio is not important, that those things are false issues. But first, I I'd like to.
We will come to that. But first, Joe, we're going to take we do a little bit of our own housekeeping here. It's a bit of fun. It's our top chatters segment, which I neglected just because it was very exciting talking about all this stuff. So I'm going to get our top chatters list up, Joe, and have a look at this because you'll be doing the same thing at the end of the show. But I'm going to get Steve, I'm going to get you this week to do our top chatters if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll start from the bottom and work up on the coast. So Amir S, Carlitos MMT, Louisa Orozco, Bill Goggin, William Thompson, P. Craig, Jim Roberts, Ari Lando, George Waters, Igor Insanic, I like that one, Brian Hode, Marcus Champ, Larimer, Derek Daniel, Botch Mandela, greetings, Ken Crawford, Thomas Darlington, Algo Rhythm, Danger Zone, Nicholas Gomez, Jovian R, Manoharan, Alex Marshall, Joe Polito, Michael Newman, Owen Wall, TR, Danny, Political Economy 101, Cybernetics, Herb Wiseman, Shote, Bob Dones, Amir Banner Hashemi, Tony Wilson, Economics 1 Lesson, Gavin Van, Rob Pierce, Web Freaks, Dredge Eye, Hugh N, Michael de Souza Cruz, Rick O'Brien, Bob Liori, the Skype Converser. What happened to Larry Summers?
Larry Summers has left the building. No, he hasn't. We've seen him. While I'm here, I'm going to plug Steve's Substack and Patreon. If you want a critical look at economics from a professor of economics, for more of stuff like we're talking about right now, join his Patreon page, patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, where most posts are free to access without a paywall. And I'm also going to take a moment because I haven't ever flogged my own business on here, and I've been told I do actually sponsor the show and should say something about it. Business Film Booth, for those of you who are interested to know, is a business that helps with conversion. So if your site and your business generally is really struggling with conversion, it's because in your comms you're lacking trust. And what Business Film Booth does is help your business with particular types of content that help you build trust so that you come across on camera with all the messages you want to without sounding like a corporate dick, basically. I don't have my notes on it, but that's pretty much the message. So let's get back to it. Joe, you were, sorry, do you want to pick up on where you were if you've not lost that train of thought? But if you haven't, I've got something I wanted to ask you, but
No, I haven't actually lost my train of thought.
Good, go for it.
Where I want to go now was to faux fiscal responsibility.
Yes, okay.
In other words, what's normally called fiscal responsibility is actually faux fiscal responsibility. And that's a pattern of fiscal policy aimed at constraining the spending of monetary sovereigns according to rules for permissible spending based on the level of outstanding debt by the government, and or the level of the debt to GDP ratio or other numerical indices which have nothing to do with public purpose.
Yeah, I mean, you haven't actually defined public service yourself yet, but I'd say what I take out of your definition of public purpose, Joe, is providing the thing the public sector is better at providing than the private sector. Is that correct?
It may be better, it may not be better, but the point is that from the point of view, from a normative point of view, with respect to the government, what the government should be doing in fiscal policy is to legislate and implement policies that satisfy various aspects of the public purpose. Okay, for example, the MMT job guarantee, is there to operationalize the right to employment. And so that's an aspect, of the public purpose. So insofar as measures such as the level of debt or the level of the debt to GDP ratio prevent the government, from implementing a job guarantee policy, then we can say that those kinds of measures are stopping the government from attaining important aspects of the public purpose and therefore are instances of faux fiscal responsibility. I hope that was clear enough.
I mean,
Actually, I like what Michael D'Souza just posted a moment ago, a quote from Abraham Lincoln. If you look at that on the side there, public purpose is to do for the people what needs to be done, which they cannot by individual effort do at all or do so well for themselves. I think it's a very nice quote.
I think
I
that's a very nice quote. Okay,
it
agree.
is, and I want to play devil's advocate, because even though I personally completely agree with all those sentiments and would like to see that, let's play the scenario in which we assume, for example, that if we change the narrative so that politicians don't have to resort to this idea that they are limited in their spending and that isn't the concern, it's assumed, you would hope, that you end up with these progressive arguments that reduce poverty, more spending in education and so on in all the right places. But is it not a danger also that you could have some populist turn up and with democratic mandate just boost military spending and extra subsidies for business and so on? So is there, and is that a public purpose defined by democratic mandate? I guess what I'm trying to get at is it can swing both ways, and the money could be spent by somebody that, we don't necessarily personally agree with, but that's still technically a public purpose, or am I missing something?
Okay, so. Okay.
And by the way, I don't agree with that. I'm just posing it as a thought experiment.
Sure. Okay, there's a difference between the public purpose, okay, as it exists. Okay, in other words, if we were to measure the public purpose, okay, of a nation by doing content analysis, okay, if it's literature, okay, or something like that, okay, by looking at collective products, okay, of the nation, and measuring the public purpose as represented by its collective cultural products, okay, then we would have a measure of public purpose, okay, which is objective, okay, intersubjective essentially, okay. But that doesn't mean it corresponds to the actual public purpose. We're always free to criticize that, and we're always free to come up with another theory, okay, of public purpose. We're all free to come up with theories of the public purpose, and they're going to differ. Okay, and also, the democratic mass of people are likely to come up with theories of the public purpose that aren't right. But still, we live in a democratic society, and to some degree, we're going to be stuck with those. But of course, if we don't think it's right, our obligation is to change it by putting forward new theories of public purpose that are better, and trying to persuade the public that they should take on a different theory of the public purpose.
Yeah, I mean, for one of the things that I can see with the way current governments behave is they're using the capacity of the state to create money to underwrite housing bubbles.
Yes.
That's certainly the case in my home country. It's the case in New Zealand as well. The UK is joining in the same way. And they just, the government money creation is used to keep up a property bubble because a large part of the electorate wants to see their house prices rise in value. They panic when there's a fall in house prices. The government dives in with money creating capability, particularly like in Australia's case has had what they call the first home buyers grant. And I would nickname that the first home vendors grant, because what happened was the government would create money. Let's say it created money equivalent to 1% of GDP, which is the scale of the grant they give at the aggregate level, and the public then takes an extra deposit of 1% of GDP and turns it into 5% worth of GDP of new credit demand, which keeps the bubble going. So you have an enormous, and also like in the military case, America's the public purpose is bombing the shit out of other parts of the world and calling it extending democracy. So we do have governments using that limitless capacity to create money. What they define as the public purpose is an abomination of what the public actually needs.
So I have a question for both Joe and Steve. Are you familiar with Robert Eisner's work on the deficit and debt accounting, and the idea that we don't measure the deficits and the debt matter, but we don't measure it correctly, right? We don't take the state and local government budgets into account either. We don't have a capital account for infrastructure. And what you really need to look, if you want to see the impact of the deficit on the economy, at the full employment budget rather than the nominal budget. And of course, it's brilliant, but always ignored. So I was wondering if you're familiar with that, and if it kind of cries out for modeling, that it can be incorporated into system dynamics modeling.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. I am familiar, with Eisner's work. His work was among those I read during the 1990s, which actually prepared me for the MMT experience as advanced by Warren Mosler. In other words, it didn't feel very strange to me. It felt like it was enlightened because it had much in common with the perspectives that Eisner was advancing in the 1990s, in the misunderstood economy, and also in the little book on Social Security that he wrote, which, by the way, was a brilliant little book. So I was very familiar with his style, of thinking at the time. I wasn't at all into economics during the 1990s. I was, strictly a knowledge management guy. I was training in that area. I was suggesting new things in that area. It was all very exciting to me. But every once in a while, I would go to the bookstore and I would leaf through some of the economic books, and I would see some really interesting things, that were being done. And Eisner was one of the people that I came upon.
One of the terrible things about the economics profession is that if you're writing at the highest levels of the profession, if any normal person opens the book, it looks like Martian language. It's all crazy math. They're doing topology now and all this stuff. There's almost no analysis of the economy. And if you write for the average person that is interested in the topic, you're seen as, well, a practitioner or whatever. You're relegated to the lower levels of the profession. Yes. And it seems to me it's just the economists have it just backwards.
Yeah, yes, you're not meant to understand the priesthood. It's all in Latin.
Right.
Yes, I was fortunate to have had a good background in statistics. In fact, I taught some graduate statistics, one point in my life. So I did have a sufficient amount, of mathematical background to approach some of the work, that was being done, in economics. I also had some undergraduate physics background, and that helped me a little in understanding some of the work of the economists as well.
Let's not aggrandize those guys. I mean, yes, they're using topology and some peculiar parts of mathematics, but they're not using appropriate mathematics for modeling a dynamic evolutionary system at all. Right. And that's the most frustration. They've chosen these idiosyncratic elements like group theory was popular at one stage, now topography, as you say, and so on. So they'll find some pure mathematician who'll help them learn this stuff, and then they'll pump neoclassical economic concepts through topology theory or group theory and so on. But it's got fuck all relevance for a dynamic evolutionary system, which is what they should be modeling. And they don't go anywhere near that mathematics. So my favorite example at the moment is still, I think it's a text by Sargent, which is called Macroeconomics with Python and Advanced Macroeconomics with Python. Now, if you read that, back to Mike Rydzecki's point earlier, everything except 4 pages in the book is in difference equations. And we're talking 2,000 pages of PDF. And the one section where they use differential equations rather than discrete equations is where they're proving the mathematical stability properties of the Higgs-Hansen second-order difference equation model of the trade cycle, which I know is economically a false model. So the one time they use the right mathematics is for a wrong model. And otherwise, it's all difference equations. Let's assume time is discrete, blah, blah, blah. And that just irritates the shit out of me, which is Thomas Sargent, which is one reason why I deliberately have not included discrete mathematical capabilities in Minsky. As Ty paraphrased earlier in the chat there, one of my little sayings is, friends don't let friends use periods. So I want to abolish the damn things from the literature, and the best way to do it is not make it available in the very first instance. because if you gave it available, regardless of the flaws, they'd continue using it.
All right, now, Joe,
Okay.
before we go on to, we're going to be moving on to talking about real fiscal responsibility very shortly, but there was a question there from Steve Frith, I noticed, and don't worry if you can't dig it out and pop it up on screen, but it was more the concept or the idea of whether bonds need to actually be issued. Do we need them to exist still? And I know that's an area that you have covered lots. So I wondered if we could start talking about that. Is there a way into the subject of bonds, where they come from for those uninitiated? Is it just a gold standard hangover? And do we really need them to fund government spending? I'm begging the question, I know.
Yeah, we do not need them to fund the spending. They actually don't fund spending anyway, because as Stephanie Kelton showed in her paper written in 1998, I believe, neither tax revenues nor bond revenues fund spending by the government. And the reason why they don't is because when the transactions are settled by the bank, the tax revenue and bond revenues, are destroyed. And then the Federal Reserve issues completely new money. I find Stephanie's argument in that paper to be very compelling. I had to read it over 3 or 4 or 5 times, certain pages, to just get really close to them. But I found the argument, to be very compelling. So, of course, if the bond revenue is going to be destroyed anyway, we do not need to issue bonds. We can just have the Federal Reserve issue the money. And one of the methods I'm going to come to, the overt congressional financing, is a way of getting the Federal Reserve to issue the money the Treasury Department needs to spend the appropriations of Congress. Okay. Now, some other people would say, or might say, some other people in MMT, might say, I think they'd agree with what I said, but they also might say that as a political matter, to issue bonds is useful because businesses like to have safe places to park their money, and to buy bonds is a safe place. The counter to that, which also comes out of MMT, is that, well, the Federal Reserve can pay interest. It's already paying interest on reserves. The difference between the interest the Treasury pays and the interest the Federal Reserve pays is that the Treasury interest on bonds, is higher, but there's nothing preventing the Federal Reserve from raising the interest, it pays, if you want a safe place for money. People can have accounts at the Federal Reserve and they can, pay higher interest. So the whole business of issuing bonds and having debt and looking at the aggregate of debt and looking at this great figure and getting scared, that's not necessary, at all. Because if it were the Federal Reserve that were paying the interest, then that would not be getting on any balance sheets, as debt. It's exactly the same thing functionally, but it wouldn't be considered debt. But it is debt. In other words, the reserves are liabilities of the government, and the Federal Reserve, which is part of the government, would be paying interest on the reserves. So it's functionally the same thing.
But it's still sustainable. That's the difference, at least in the narrative. I mean, it always has been, but the narrative is, oh, well, it's not sustainable. But you're saying perfectly is. There's no difference.
Oh, it's perfectly sustainable because any time we have the debt or debt to G ratio get to be a political problem, we can issue coins to take care of it or use overt congressional financing to take care of it. I mean, it's really a political problem. It's not a fiscal capability problem.
Very good. Steve or Mike, I don't mind which of you ever think about this, but it's always interesting to look at where this comes from in the system that we exist in with bonds, because it has its history and roots in the gold standard, and that somehow it's managed to hang on, which I find amazing. How did it hang on at the end of the gold standard? It's always surprised me.
Well, like the one thing that I'm differ with as MMT to some extent, because I can use Minsky to do a complete accounting system of the government. I don't break the government. I don't aggregate the government of the central bank and treasury together. I think you've got to have them separately. When you do that, you find that if the government doesn't sell bonds, then it has an account at the central bank, which is the Consolidated Revenue Fund. That's where the transfers from the CRF to the Treasury reserves actually create the money that's created by a deficit and creates the reserves as well. Now, if that keeps on going, if you have tax revenue coming in, but of course spending being greater than tax revenue, therefore that's a negative change for the CRF. And so if the government doesn't have another thing that it can get positive revenue into the CRF from, the CRF goes into overdraft. And if you want to have a government which doesn't issue bonds, then you're going to have a government that has an overdraft at the Federal Reserve. Now, that technically speaking, that's fine. There's no problem at all with that as an operational thing. But it means people look at the accounts and what they see is there's the government's bank account and it's negative. What's going on here? Now, if they sell bonds, and the bonds, of course, the bonds are purchased with the funds, not money, the funds created by the deficit, which turn up in the settlement accounts of the banks. They then use those settlement accounts to purchase the bonds. That then means there's you reverse the direction of causation that applies when the deficit is run, where the CRF going down causes reserves to go up. When the bonds are purchased, the reserves go down, and the bonds are then created, and they then add to the CRF and give a positive inflow to the CRF. So if you don't have bond sales, I can't actually see a way around it. I haven't tried modelling it, but intuitively there doesn't seem to be a way around it. If you don't issue bonds, the Treasury is going to have an overdraft account at the central bank. Now that's I think an inevitable consequence of not issuing bonds.
Joe, go ahead.
Okay, let me consider that. Okay, a little later. In light of the specific things I recommend for creating money. Okay, and let's see if that changes the picture. Okay, at all. Okay,
sure, so we'll come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. Okay, in just a little while. Okay, so we did faux fiscal responsibility. Now, finally, I want to get to real fiscal responsibility. Okay, so real fiscal responsibility is a pattern of fiscal policy intended to achieve public purpose, such as full employment, price stability, a first-class educational system, a Medicare for all system, Green New Deal, job guarantee, while also maintaining or increasing fiscal sustainability. Okay, now you might ask, how can fiscal sustainability be increased, okay, for a monetary sovereign? It's always the same. And the answer I would give to that is that if the government fulfills the public purpose, then the consequence is going to be that the legitimacy of the government, okay, is greater, is going to increase. And the more the legitimacy of the government increases, then the more the fiscal sustainability of the monetary sovereign can be safeguarded. So that's the way I would put that. To go on with the statement, though, while also maintaining or increasing fiscal sustainability, viewed as the extent to which patterns of government spending do not undermine the capability of the government to continue to spend to achieve its public purpose.
Joe, is this the graphic you'd like us to put up just now about the OCF?
We're getting to it.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So now what I want to talk about is creating money. In the U.S. system, One way to do this is through platinum coin seigniorage. The way platinum coin seigniorage works is there was a 1995 bill that passed the Congress, which allows the Secretary of the Treasury to order the mint, to create a 1-ounce platinum coin and arbitrarily specify the face value of that coin. So, of course, the example that's become famous is the $1 trillion coin. But I don't think the $1 trillion coin is really such a game changer. I think the $100 trillion coin, is a game changer because that's enough to cover the repayment of debt and all the deficits for some years. But do you want to know more about how the coin seigniorage works?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what happens is that the order comes from the Secretary of the Treasury to mint the 1-ounce platinum coin, with the face value of, I prefer to use the example of $100 trillion. Okay, so then, of course, the platinum coin is deposited at the New York Fed, where the public enterprise fund account of the mint, exists. The platinum coin is deposited in the public enterprise fund account. Then the Fed has to decide whether to credit the platinum coin, or not. And there are a lot of disputes. There's a lot of talking about whether the Fed will have to credit, the coin. The Fed is the primary banking agent, of the Treasury Department. That is set by law. The Treasury Department really can't go anywhere else. So there are two considerations here. Will the Fed decide to credit, the platinum coin? And if the Fed chair decides not to credit the platinum coin, can the Treasury Department then do anything about it? Well, there's a federal law, actually the Federal Reserve Act says, in one of the provisions of the Federal Reserve Act. So if there's interpretation, of a monetary issue where the chair of the Fed but disagrees with the Secretary of the Treasury, the interpretation of the Secretary of the Treasury shall be controlling. So if the chair of the Fed decides not to accept and credit the coin, then technically the the chair of the Fed creates a cause for the Secretary of the Treasury to go to the president and ask the president to fire the Fed chair for cause. What I'm saying is that according to the way the laws are written, the Treasury Secretary can command the Federal Reserve Chair to credit that coin. It doesn't matter how large the coin it is, even if it's a quadrillion-dollar coin. The Secretary of the Treasury can command the chair of the Fed, to credit it.
So there's provision in the legislation for it. And I think when I first heard it, it sounded like one of those gag things. You think it was something from The Onion. And it sounds so ridiculous that it wasn't possible. But then it turns out, like you say, it's provisioned, it's in there. Whether or not it was originally written for that purpose is not the point. The point is you can do it. And the implications of it have real world consequences.
Yes, the point is you can do it, and the other point is that when you actually manufacture the coin and you deposit it, at the Fed, there's the authority in another part of the Federal Reserve Act for the Treasury to force the Fed chair to credit the coin. So what happens is the coin goes to the Fed places it, okay, in its vault. It becomes an asset, okay, in the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve then marks up, the reserve account, okay, of the specifically the public enterprise fund account with the face value of the coin. Okay, how does it get from there into the Treasury spending account? Well, there's another part of the law that says, okay, that the Treasury Department can sweep the public enterprise fund account for the seigniorage, okay, in the coin. Okay, what is the seigniorage? It's the face value of the coin minus the cost of minting the coin and getting it up to the Federal Reserve in New York and depositing it, okay, at the Federal Reserve. If you estimate the cost of the coin to mint it and to get it up there might be $5,000 or $6,000, then the platinum coin seigniorage would be $100 trillion minus the $6,000, virtually the $100 trillion. Okay, so that would eventually end up in the Treasury spending account. Now, the important thing to note is that that doesn't mean that the Treasury would have the authority to spend $100 trillion. It would not have that authority. It would have the authority to spend congressional appropriations. It would have the authority to also pay back debt, but it would not have the authority to spend any more. Oh, and by the way, it wouldn't have the authority to pay back debt in a willy-nilly fashion. It has to pay back debt according to the contract. In other words, when the Fed debt actually falls due, then the government has to pay it off with the interest, okay, specified, okay, in the bond, okay, or the other security. Okay, so it wouldn't be a case of the federal government paying off the debt in one lump sum. In other words, $35 trillion right now. But it would be the case that the federal government would pay off all the debt as it falls due.
As it matures, understand?
Yes, as it matures. And as long as it pays it off, okay, as it matures, it would not be, okay, inflationary. It would not be any more inflationary than the normal process of paying off the debt is.
And if I can jump in for a sec, so Joe, can I ask Steve then, in referring to the argument you made just before, Steve, about you would still then have an overdraft at some point and so on. How does that change the game, if at all, from your point of view? What would be some of the things that happen if you put 100 trillion in the bank with the Treasury?
Ty actually made a good point on the discussion a moment ago, which I've just put together in Minsky, and yes, he's right. It'd be quite easy for if there's no bonds, then it's quite feasible as well for the central bank to make a loan to the Treasury, and the loan to the Treasury means the assets of the Treasury rising. If let's say lend $2 trillion, then that $2 trillion also turns up in the liability account, which is the Treasury, and the Treasury can spend out of that, and it won't have to go into overdraft. So if you abolish bonds, which is one potential thing, then you have to agree that the central bank can make loans to the Treasury, and a lot of countries still ban that legally, make it impossible for that to happen. The cute thing about the coin, and this is something that Joe probably knows more about than I do, so I'll say what I know and get Joe to say whether I'm right or wrong on it. It appears that in America, and this again is common globally, most of the world, the Treasury has the responsibility for printing notes. Hang on. No, sorry. The Treasury, the central bank has the responsibility for printing notes, and the Treasury has the responsibility for coins. It's just an arbitrary division of responsibilities. You could either one could do both, or they could swap the roles. There's no practical reason why it has to be that way. But the Treasury can produce coins, and the central banks can produce notes. Okay. Now with the coin, I think that act that Joe would know the details of again better than me, the American Act that allowed the government to create this coin, there was discussion about limiting the value that be put on the coin. And I think a bit like saying, hang on, when we build this liner, do you think we should have life rafts or not? Yeah, I think we should have life rafts. Okay, so for that reason, they didn't put a limit on the scale of the value of the coin, and therefore that's the loophole that the lawyers didn't close off the capacity for the state to do the right thing because they thought, shit, if we hit an iceberg, maybe we need some life rafts, and I think that might be part of the why that particular stupid idea didn't actually get into legislation.
Okay.
And Mike, can I? Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead, Joe. Sorry,
Joe, but
I'm
no,
getting in
Joe,
your way.
yeah, Joe, yeah,
I'm going to say something about that.
yeah.
In the United States, it is one of those countries where the power to issue the paper currency and the reserves lies with the central bank, but the power to issue the coin is a power that's still retained by the Treasury.
Yeah.
That is the way. Okay, it works here.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking, if you go on a tour of any of the Federal Reserve banks, the souvenir you get at the end is ground up currency in a plastic thing. So, and you
Is that
can
what they give you?
see it. Yeah, and you can they
or
take you
shredded.
by,
Yeah.
and you can look in through glass windows at the pallets of the old bills that are going to be ground up. So, so absolutely right.
Yeah, that was something Warren raised in his book. He was making the point also that taxes don't fund anything. Okay, and the example he was given is that if you take your money over to the Treasury to pay your taxes, and you pay your taxes in cash, then what happens to that cash? It gets ground up.
Literally.
Now, is that just if humor me here? Is that with every last note that's handed in, or the notes that are degraded and run down?
No, I think it's with every note, okay, that's handled in. If it's handled in payment of taxes, the exact same settlement process, okay, is followed as if you were handing them a check. Okay, so the bank settlement destroys the cash. Okay, and then the physical cash has to be destroyed because the central bank has issued new reserves in order to cover that cash payment.
Of course, most tax payments are made by bank transfers.
Yes.
But if people did pay their taxes by money, by notes, then you're saying the practice in America is that those notes, they record them, and that therefore reduces it eliminates their tax liability, and then the actual sheets of paper are turned into dust.
Right, they
Shredded.
To illustrate this, at UMKC, I guess you call it one of the founding homes of modern monetary theory, right?
Oh, yes.
The students there who took courses from Stephanie Kelton and Randy Ray and so forth often wouldn't believe what they were being taught, right? Because it just is so, again, counterintuitive, fallacy of composition and what have you. So what did they do? They said, we're going to run the modern monetary theory system for you. And so you could take econ classes that were designated public service courses. And so it wasn't mandatory, it was voluntary, right? And on day one in class, if you elected a public service version of the course, the government, the university, assigned you a tax liability. You were taxed. And you were taxed, I think it was 2 roos. And the kangaroo.
Buckaroos.
Yeah.
Buckaroos.
And the university would spend, the government would spend the buckaroos in the community, like at a soup kitchen or an elderly person's house who needed their lawn cut. And the students had to earn the roos so they could pay off their tax liability to get their grade. And what they would do when they would pay off their tax liability is they'd tear up right in front of them the roos and throw them away. Same idea.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly the same idea.
I can't escape the idea of the $100 trillion coin somehow being, one of those sleight of hand things or an accident. We need to pay off that debt now. Can we have that $100 trillion coin? Yeah, sure. I had it here somewhere. I'm not sure where.
Actually, I've got to dive in here with a joke. Okay, because there's a fabulous Australian comedian. I've forgotten his name. I saw him do this live about it must be 30 years ago. And Australia, if you actually look, Australia has a 50-cent coin, which is about yay big. Okay, and then there's a $1 coin, which is about this big, and a $2, which is this big. And they're getting smaller and smaller over time. And he said, this trend's going to go on. You're going to go shopping one day, and you're going to say, like, I want to buy that motorbike. And the guy says, oh, where'd you pay me? He said, I've already paid you. It's on the counter. Can't you see it?
Yeah, right.
You're paying in dust
And then he
particles.
said, oh, you paid me. If you give me one coin, you paid me too much. He says, keep the change.
Right.
The coin you
I
can't
remember-
see.
I remember going to Istanbul for a conference years ago and exchanging money at the airport and getting million Turkish lira notes. And we were going, we're millionaires. And I do think a student of mine brought me a $1 trillion Zimbabwe note that I have in my school office. Otherwise, I would hold it up here. So it happens.
So all joking aside, because I know the implications of are huge, and so they need to be taken seriously. I just wanted to now, if I can, Joe, draw your attention to the idea of real fiscal responsibility in terms of, I guess, the implications. What are the things that would happen over time? Over the time you've got the drawing down of the loans that would be paid back as they mature. Are there implications that happen internationally or anything like that are worth talking about? Because a country doing this on their own, like the United States, would have a big impact. A country maybe like a smaller country like the UK may not. Are there any things that you've thought about that are important to discuss internationally, maybe, or within the economy that changed dramatically?
Okay, well, I think what changes dramatically is you don't have these austerity mongers around anymore. Let's say in the first year you pay off a lot of the short-term debt. Okay, and that amounts. I haven't checked, but recently how much of the short-term debt would be paid off in the first year. Okay, but I think it would be something like 30 to 35% of the total debt. It might even be as high as 50%, okay, the total debt. So what happens there is that everybody can see that instead of the government owing $35 trillion, all of a sudden, after the first year, it owes only $16 trillion. So people seeing that happen when they check the daily Treasury statement or seeing that happen through news reports, okay, of what's happening, they realize that the government was easily able to pay 50% or 30% of the debt or whatever the figure is in the first year. Okay, and so now people who are worried about the size of the debt or the size of the debt to GDP ratio no longer have a leg to stand on.
Yeah.
So now they have to begin to discuss the merits or lack of it of certain spending proposals. Now it's going to allow some areas of policy where people are going to run wild. Okay, in other areas of policy, the consequences, okay, are going to be better. Okay, but at least we're going to have a situation where this is going to be subject to congressional debate, to normal politics, with people inquiring whether it's wise to spend money in this way or not. It's going to lead to people starting to evaluate not only the consequences of policy. In other words, they won't be evaluating it any longer in terms of the size of the debt, or the debt to GDP ratio or fiscal sustainability. They would actually be looking at the consequences of the policy options and there would be think tanks that would be spending their time evaluating the real world consequences, okay, of the policy options. This is true with the foreign policy options, and it's true of all the domestic policy options. Okay, and I think that's the main consequence of it, and that's why it would be so important. We would finally get people talking about the merits of particular policy proposals, rather than talking about how much debt is going to create for us.
There's a
that's why,
question
like,
there from Economics in One
from
Lesson. Isn't that
so
literally
yes,
a confidence trick? Can we
yes,
address that at all?
yes, it's a confidence trick, and it's in the place of a con job. Because the current situation is a con job saying the government has to borrow money in order to spend, which is bullshit. And this is one of the reasons that I find so irritating to deal with neoclassicals in general, but because they simply are putting forward proposition would violate the rules of accounting. Now, what this is saying, look, government creates money by double entry bookkeeping. That's what actually happens. And the moment that then generates the issue, they've got to issue bonds to complete that overall circuit so they remain in non-negative balances. We can eliminate that in two ways. One is the Federal Reserve makes loans, as Ty suggested, makes loans to the Treasury. So the Treasury is in debt to the central bank. And who owns the central bank? The Treasury does. So suddenly you see, well, hang on, is that really a problem, practically speaking? No. Equally, the coin does the same thing. Yeah, dude. Oh my God, the government's been is one coin in debt. Well, let's make it a bigger coin then. Okay. So we get rid of the whole issue that the government faces a financial constraint. The real issue, and this is again, as has just been said, that it's really the policies that matter. And should we be bombing the shit out of out of Ukraine? Should we be bombing the shit out of Palestine? That's the use of government money being put to right now. Wouldn't it be better to have some decent education and decent healthcare in America? Wouldn't it be better to fix up your roads? Wouldn't it be better to put down high-speed rail, et cetera, et cetera? So what we end up not even discussing things which the military-industrial complex wants to do. That can't be questioned. You never get, can we afford to create those bombs as part of the argument? It's always, can we afford that social security? Can we afford that health? Get rid of the can we afford question. So what are we doing with our capacity to create money? At the moment, we're terrorizing the rest of the world and funding Ponzi schemes. What we're saying instead is we should be doing much more for social security, for health, for education, for welfare, and stop bombing the shit out of the rest of the world, which gets a free pass in this discussion.
Yes, exactly. And then also the other important thing is that right now people think in terms, we have to get money from the rich in order to fund things. We're dependent on the rich. We can't get along without the rich. We have to persuade them. We have to control them.
Let's be nice to the rich. Let's be nice to the rich. Yeah.
Let's be nice to the rich. Instead, we have a situation where we know we're not at all dependent on the rich because we're a fiat sovereign. And learning that, for people to learn that, I think is tremendously important because they wouldn't be celebrating the rich so much if they didn't think they need to have the money of the rich to do anything important.
Well, I want to see the coin minted tomorrow. How do we make it happen? How does it? How does it get started?
I think some of the concepts, people saying "my precious," it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
We should make it into a ring, okay, and engrave the numbers around the outside. Yeah,
you could do it. You could have it
power.
done with a pay-per-view and have people subscribe to watch it being made. Make it a competition like the blacksmithing show, Forged in Fire.
My precious.
Okay, so I want to move now to a second way of creating the money to do this. It's not as sexy as the platinum coin.
Dang.
Okay, but it's. I still think it's very sexy. Okay, I originally thought about doing this because I was reading a blog at Bill Mitchell's site, and he was talking about the idea of overt monetary financing. In fact, he was talking about it in the context of the UK system. and something that one of the monetary authorities in the UK system had said. And so he had this blog on what was involved in it. And I was thinking about it in terms of the American context. And I immediately saw that a second way to create money would simply to have overt congressional financing, okay, or OCF. And the way that works is Congress, at the time it passes a money bill, it orders the Fed to use its ability to create money out of thin air to add reserves to the Treasury spending account equal to the amount of its appropriations plus the amount of principal plus interest on federal debt falling due during the period of the appropriation. Okay, and so the graphic that I gave you gives the language that could become the boilerplate, okay, of any money bill to make this happen. Okay, and okay, if you put that up at this point,
Yeah, that's up there, Joe.
Can see the language. Okay, and there it is. Upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Federal Reserve with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. In addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation. So that covers the gradual repayment of debt with interest, and it covers the amount of the appropriation. So it doesn't matter whether the appropriation involves any deficit spending or not. It covers the amount of the appropriation. Okay. And according to the Constitution, Congress has the power to create money. Okay, but for some reason, when Congress does appropriations, okay, it doesn't order the Fed to create the money. That seems silly to me. Why doesn't Congress just do that? So I put this forward as a piece of boilerplate to go into every money bill. And I figure once we do it once or twice, it will become, okay, a boilerplate item because everybody will see that's the sensible thing to do, you know, when you do an appropriation. Why should you rely on tax money? Why should you rely, okay, on bonds? Just have Congress order the Fed to create the reserves in the Treasury spending account. Of course, on the other end, it would be necessary for the Fed to change, okay, its business rules and not credit the Treasury spending account when bonds are sold or tax revenues are collected. In other words, it would have to explicitly recognize that when that money comes back to the Fed for settlement, it is actually zeroed out in the process of settlement. And so the Fed would explicitly recognize that and not put any new money into the Treasury spending account. In other words, all the new money would come from the orders of Congress.
Now, Mike, that's not as sexy as the coin, but what do you think?
You're muted, mate. You're muted.
I know. We're talking about redesigning the airplane to make it fly better. And there are some very clever and well thought out redesigns for the plane that are being articulated right here and now. My question would be, whose ox is going to get gored? Because people are used to doing things their way, and they have things set up their way, and those are the people who are going to object. Take the U.S. tax code. No one in their right mind would design it from scratch the way it is. And there have been proposals put forth where you could do your taxes on the back of a postcard and pay a lower marginal rate, and you'd be done. It would take you all of 5 minutes to do your income taxes. Well, if you did that, every CPA in the United States would lose their minds, and H&R Block and all the tax preparation people and all the people involved with the home ownership sector, with mortgage interest being deductible. So many oxes would be gored. You'd have this tsunami of lobbyists and news events and whatever voting it down. So, it's not so much that we don't have clever ways of fixing things. It's getting them adopted to, because we're path dependent. We're locked into a crappy way of doing things.
And that actually
How
applies.
you pry the system out of that and redesign the airplane, and that I don't know.
And that's the thing about bonds as well, of course, because the bond market is the largest financial market on the planet. And we get and this is one of Morris Moses' recent points that I agree with. Some of them I don't, as you know. But that one about the interest payments on new bonds being an income source for people who hold bonds, because we're now talking debt being roughly 100% of GDP. So a 5% rate of interest on bonds means a 5% stimulus to the economy out of interest payments on those bonds. But most of the bonds are owned by the financial sector. A large number of wealthy Americans now buying them as well, as I found out when I was in the States recently. But generally speaking, it goes to the finance sector. So the finance sector has got a stream of income coming from the government equivalent to 5% of GDP. That's their baseline in that sense then. And then, of course, they get involved in the trading. And they buy and sell against each other, and some win, some lose. The aggregate costs are enormous. But if you actually did something which abolished the need to issue government bonds, you'd abolish the largest financial market on the planet. Now, that's going to make the finance sector scream. I personally would enjoy listening to it.
But it makes it politically difficult to do, is that I think what Mike's getting at. And to follow up on that was Moses' words were a basic income for people who already have money in proportion to the money they already have, which I think is a great way of reminding yourself what those instruments actually are. But Joe, you were saying, I think Steve, you mentioned this, if you do keep them to some degree, Joe, you followed up with it, to the replacement could be that you are actually holding money with a central bank, have accounts there for businesses and others where they could still earn money based on their interest, but it's not a debt. So that could still be there in place. You wouldn't necessarily, you could politically get around it that way. Am I right, Joe?
Yes, you could politically get around it, in that way. The other way, you're getting around it is you could still issue debt, but everybody would realize that the government was issuing debt in order to give a safe place for businesses to put their money, and that the sale of bonds would not have any implications for actually funding appropriations. In other words, everybody would realize it's just a favor we're doing for business. It's not because we're using the revenue to fund appropriations.
In theory, could individuals buy those as well and say, look, I want to earn 4 or 5% interest where it's completely safe. I don't want to be involved in this casino anymore, in which case you could argue that that's a public good, maybe?
I think that's a public good, but I think it's also true that it's very easy for the Federal Reserve simply to pay the interest and the Treasury, not to get involved at all in issuing bonds.
So I think one other aspect of not being able to redesign the airplane, even though we know how to it should be redesigned, is deference to authority. And you may recall the famous Milgram experiments done by Stanley Milgram of the Yale.
I recall that very well.
Yeah, where he was interested in the Holocaust, like how could they get ordinary people to do these terrible things? And one argument was, well, they deferred to authority. They were ordered to do it. And so he had subjects come in and he would say, you got a learner in there who's making mistakes, turn up voltage, shock them. And when they kept making mistakes, shock them some more. And they people would raise the voltage. They weren't really doing it, but they didn't know that, enough to kill them. And they were just following the authority figure. Well, the professor told me to shock the guy. So, okay. So if you have a Nobel Prize Or you teach at Harvard in the economics department at Harvard, like, Reinhardt and Rogoff. And you say, so when debt to GDP gets above 90%, you got to go austerity. Well, they're an authority. They have the Nobel Prize. They teach at Harvard. Mike Radzicki doesn't. Who are they going to listen to?
Firestone
The authority figure. So I think there's a lot of that. Experts, they get on TV with credentials or whatever, and the people follow the authority figure.
Yeah. Also, these narratives, I'll give you a personal experience from trying to talk about these things. For my own sins, I've got an obsession with the automated transaction tax. And Steve, I've heard you and Phil talk about that on podcasts as well. And I made an article about it, and in the capacity that I have just as a citizen, I put it on LinkedIn saying, this is not my usual work. This is just something I wanted to talk about. And I linked in my accountant, who I talk about with this stuff all the time. And of course, he unlinked himself from that association because he can't be seen talking about it, because it would completely affect his work if that was normalized as a conversation and actually became law. So there's, anybody that's involved is going to have pushback and ways of circumventing talking about bonds and so on. And that's a big community and a big influential community at that.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite sayings from Leonard Cohen comes to mind once more, and that is, we are locked into our sufferings and our pleasures are the seal.
I'm thinking about that. But anyway, I only have a small brain compared to you guys. So I'm going to get, as we're getting near the top of the hour, and Joe, I'm going to get you to take on a challenge here, and we're going to get you to read the top chatters list. Now, you can read it as fast as you like, is the ideal, and without a single stumble, and then you'll be the first guest that ever did that, and you get a prize, which I can't think of what it's going to be. But you give it a go. Any way you want to read them when you're ready.
Okay, the Skype converser, Bob Liori, Rick O'Brien, Michael DeSouza Cruz, Hugh N., Dr. Igea. I'm afraid I'm not doing it very well without any stumbling. But anyway, Webby Breaks, Rob Pierce, Gavin Van, Economics in One Lesson, Tony Wilson. Okay, then it's Amir Ba'i Hashimi, Bob Duns, Shot, Herb Wiseman, Cybernetics, Political Economy 101, Danny, TR, Owen Wall, Michael Newman, Joe Polito, Alex Marshall, Manar Haran, Jovian R., Nicholas Gomez, Danger Zoe, Digirism, Thomas Starlington, Ken Crawford, Butch Mandela, Derek McDonald, Larimer, Marcus Champ, Brian Hody, Igor and Sanic, George Waters, Ari Lando, Jim Roberts, P. Craig, William Thompson, Bill Goggin, Luisella Crosco, Carlitos MMT, and Amir S.
All right.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Amazing, well done. I was joking about not stumbling. Literally no one does. I absolutely butchered it when I did it. It was terrible. So no one's asked me since.
Do we have time to talk a little bit about the federal job guarantee?
We sure do. You go right ahead.
Okay, what I wanted to do is to outline a position on the federal job guarantee and the basic income, okay, the universal basic income. Okay, and I'm not sure I want to discuss the philosophical issues involved, but from my point of view, there are two rights involved. There's a right to employment if someone wants to be employed, and there's a right to subsistence, okay, if they don't want to be employed. So the specific policy proposal that I have in mind is, which is facilitated, by the way, by having a fiat sovereign government, okay, is that there be a living wage which is socially inclusive, cost adjusted for the region, okay, of one nation, okay, because of course cost of living is very different, from region to region. So to cost adjust it, specifically what you do is you start with the lowest cost in the country, and you specify a living wage that's socially inclusive for that, then it's very simple to make a cost adjustment, using the CPI or some other index to cost adjust, up to the highest cost. So then you have a variety of living wages, but cost adjusted by the cost of living, okay, in different areas. Okay, and then I propose to take care of the right of subsistence that there also be, okay, a basic income. Okay, I would say that it's kind of a universal basic income because everybody would be entitled to receive it, but not necessarily to keep it. My proposition is that it be 2/3 of the size of the job guarantee wage. Okay, in some place such as say New York City, the job guarantee wage might be as high as $35 an hour. Okay, in that city. Okay, so 2/3 of that is what uh, $22 an hour, $23 an hour. So uh, one would get a basic income, okay, of that kind. That's far more per month than the normal $1,000 a month proposal for a basic income. Okay, of course, that would be cost adjusted across the country in the same way that the job guarantee, okay, is cost adjusted. So if one does that, then the job guarantee still works in the way the MMTers want it to work. It still serves as a price anchor. But you can also have a basic income that fulfills, okay, the needs of people who are not able to work, or who don't want to work for some reason, or who can't work for some reason, who just want to sit down and write a book and don't want to be bothered, okay, with anything else. They want to subsist. So that's the proposal that I offer, and to people who are uh, who advocate very strongly for a universal basic income, I want to point out, okay, that the specific proposal that I offered has a much higher basic income level than the normal proposals, okay, for basic income. That's the first thing to point out. Okay, now what happens when someone, over a certain income level gets such a basic income? Okay, in my view, what the government ought to do is tax it back. So it becomes a part of the regular taxation system. They're not entitled to a basic income, because they make too much. Okay, and there's no need, to set up, a bureaucracy to assess need because uh, the bureaucracy for collecting taxes can easily handle a situation where somebody, is making too much. In other words, they would just be a surtax, okay, on their income, that would be equal to the basic income. So I just wanted to put forward that sort of proposal because I know that there are people who comment on your stream who are very interested, okay, in basic incomes and who tend to oppose the job guarantee to the basic income. Uh, I'm saying uh, it's okay to have both.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that is not necessary at all for that to impact the normal social safety net. It's just an add on to the normal social safety net, and it can work in a very simple way.
Joe, I, for one, am
I'm
so pleased you've said that they can both work together because I think it's a huge problem that there seems to be this big disconnect between some people who support one or the other. And I tend to find the fire is coming from job guarantee supporters who think that somehow the UBI is just deconstructing that. But also because Warren Moser himself talked about it being a problem, which I've never heard. I don't understand the arguments for anyway. Steve or Mike?
I agree entirely with Joe here. I think there are a lot of the opposition to universal basic income does some for people who support the job guarantee, and I wonder to what extent is that the state of American social services that are so bad. Of course, if you don't have a job, you're on the streets in America, and they feel, well, we need basic services first is often the refrain you'll get from them. You live in a country like the Netherlands, where I'm living right now, or to some extent even still Australia, despite the way it's being fucked over by years of conservative government there. The services exist. You already get those services. So it's not that you're filling in some hole or, you got to get the services first. A country with a sensible understanding of what government spending is about, to relatively speaking, a sensible understanding, expect the state to provide basic services, health, public transport, and so on. America doesn't provide any of those things. You're on your bloody own. And they're what they're saying, we want to do catch up. Well, the rest of the world's already there. So you don't have to argue against the UBI to argue for a job guarantee. They can be compatible.
Yes.
That is a great place to leave it. We're just about at the top of the hour. Joe, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on Real Time with Steve Keen and Friends. And I think we will, I don't speak for the other guys here, I'm sure we're going to have you back at some point, and we'll be probably just doing a dedicated episode on that, because that's a whole subject in itself, isn't it? So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you've had a great session. I hope we've covered all the things that you were hoping for. And although we might be taking a break next week, we'll be back in touch as soon as we are back with a new guest on Twitter. But share this episode with anybody that's got questions that Joe may have been able to answer for them. That'd be really helpful for the show. Of course, comment in the YouTube stream as well afterwards, because there's plenty of comments there and the conversation can continue. So, Mike, Steve, thank you so much. And Joe, thank you so much. And we'll see you all again soon. And Joe, stick around. We'll have a chat afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave.
Well, bye-bye.
Steve.